All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's officially 4 o'clock. I'd like to welcome you to the next lesson in the Cyber Career Lab. Our official speech, the Cyber Career Lab was created for people who cannot afford thousands of dollars for degree programs or certification training. Our guided lessons expose beginning and intermediate professionals to relevant content that equips them to enter the security workforce and grow in their careers. We intentionally pair hour-long, supposed to be engaging sessions with great instructors and guests that have succeeded in creating valuable experiences for everybody, regardless of their professional level. Whether you're thinking about entering the field, you have some experience, or you consider yourself a subject matter expert, the Cyber Career Lab is for you. Our weekly lessons and support from the online community and Discord are designed to equip everyone to keep growing in critical cybersecurity knowledge and skills, and also to help them keep pace with an ever-changing profession. Closing the skills gap is difficult because outside of this platform, few organizations are focusing on entry-level and early career professionals. I decided to solve this problem by giving the content away and inviting everybody to join us. And I'd like to thank you, whether you're listening live or listening to the recording, for being part of the experience. Now, for today's session, we are still in season 1 that's focusing on professionalism and perspective in cybersecurity. And one of the most important cybersecurity things that you should be familiar with is the management of risk. We spent the first 2 episodes talking about different aspects of risk, where Malcolm Harkins helped me introduce the topic. Last week, we talked about important risk management practices that cover a broad spectrum of ideas and information. And for this week, we're focusing specifically on risk assessment. As a review, one of the things that's very important to understand is context. Context is always going to matter when you're communicating information security risk to the business. When you're dealing with information security risk, the example that I gave in episode 2 about the bald tire example is a good way to frame the conversation. If I start talking about risk, if I start talking about the risk of a bald tire without providing context, most people are going to jump to conclusions. The number one conclusion that people jump to is that they assume the bald tire that is the focus of our concern is on a motor vehicle that we're actually using in practice. The nature of the risk of the bald tire shifts drastically when we move the tire to a different location and use it for a different purpose. In the example that I gave last week, we talked about a bald tire on a tire swing, and it helps identify that rather than focusing on the danger that is produced by driving on an improperly equipped tire on a motor vehicle, the risk of a bald tire on a tire swing really is not that significant. Now what we're talking about is the risk related to the strength and the effectiveness of the rope that attaches the swing to whatever you've connected it to, and then the location of the structure that supports the swing. So if it's a tree in my backyard and the tree is not falling to pieces and at risk of falling over, the overall risk of having a tire attached to a swing with a rope is very low. Whereas if it's a tree that's on death's door, that's on the edge of a cliff, that could allow you to fall to your doom, that's going to be a completely different risk where the location, the item, and all of the other factors disconnected from the tire itself are really the focus of our risk concerns, which allows us to think about what controls are we going to put in place to reduce that risk to an acceptable level. Now, whenever we're talking about risk for cybersecurity, risk is always going to fall into 4 categories. Resilience represents the impact of a risk event occurring and causing some harm to the business. And when we say resilience, we're talking about operations. And so if I have a risk of downtime, or if I have the risk that my manufacturing plant is no longer going to be working to produce widgets, that is a level of risk that the business is going to understand, and based on their understanding, they can put controls and countermeasures in place. Another type of risk is revenue. Most business people understand the impact that a risk event has on the revenue that the organization is generating, and so it causes them to sit up, to pay attention, and to consider all of the factors that are going to help them reduce risk to an acceptable level so that the revenue that's being generated by the organization is not affected. In a lot of cases, regulatory requirements or contractual agreements or some other obligation that's placed on the business is what we're capturing in the box that represents regulations. So it could be something like the General Data Protection Regulation. If you have international people who are logging onto your systems and you have personal information from citizens of the European Union or the European Economic Area. Or we could have regulations that come from the California Consumer Protection Act or the US Privacy Act or HIPAA or any other form of regulation that comes from a regulatory body. Or in the case of organizations that process credit cards, it could be the payment card industry data security standard, whereby if I do not satisfy the requirements, the payment card industry is not going to allow me to store, process, or transmit credit card information, which could affect my revenue, but also affects the business overall. So regulations is a very important risk area, and understanding the impact of risk on regulatory requirements becomes very important as part of this conversation. Another area that people often overlook or discount is the reputation of the business that we're dealing with. As we've talked about in previous episodes, switching costs makes a huge difference on the reputational harm that is done when a risk event causes some kind of damage or problem for the organization. So if you look at it from a competitive forces perspective, your reputation matters very significantly if you are one of many organizations in a marketplace. For example, if we're talking about tire stores, because I use tires as the example, in and around Atlanta, there are about 25 major tire stores where I can go and get tires for my vehicle. There are national brands, there are local brands, there are used tire shops. One of those organizations having a security incident is not very significant for me personally, and the cost of me switching from one organization to one of the other 25 in the marketplace is very low. I just go somewhere else and get new tires. But if the switching cost is high, as in the case for Equifax, where Equifax and TransUnion and Experian are the only companies that provide the service that they provide, very often reputation might be harmed, but it is not so significant that the company stops doing business. And so it's one consideration among all the other considerations that you have to look at, and it's part of the equation when you're describing the context for risk. Now you might be thinking, hey, I thought our conversation was about risk assessment, and the conversation is focused on risk assessment, but understanding the inputs and the outputs for the entire risk management process are very important. The context is related to scope, and scope and context are your primary inputs that you're going to consider when you're doing a risk assessment. When you do the assessment, you're going to identify risk, you're going to analyze risk and evaluate everything that you've seen. And based on those findings, you're going to identify a treatment plan, accept the residual risk that remains, and then make sure that you communicate and monitor the results of the risk management process. This diagram highlights the standard approach, but this approach is going to apply whether we're talking about information security risk or project risk or enterprise risk or financial risk or any other business risk that people care about. As part of the goal of the Cyber Career Lab, the objective in this conversation is just to make sure that everybody understands the entire risk management process, because the entire process needs to be understood and recognized before you can start to think about how do I conduct a risk assessment. Another part of the process, as a matter of review, is related to the tiered risk management approach that we talked about last week. The rules for conducting a risk assessment need to be consistent, and they need to come from an appropriate authority within the organization. In a lot of organizations, people overlook the rules for governance and management when they're dealing with risk. They just jump into the process and start following instructions, and there's no guidance to influence the outcome that's produced. Under ideal circumstances, everything that you do in risk management, especially when you're dealing with information security risk or cybersecurity risk, should relate to rules that are established by the board or senior leaders of the organization. These days, the recommendation is for a dedicated risk committee on the board of directors or the chief executive officer as the senior leader within the organization to define all of the risk management requirements. As we discussed in episode 2, these decisions are made at the organization level. One of the big problems we face in cybersecurity is the fact that most people in an organization are disconnected from and don't participate in the risk management process, and nothing is really happening at the organization level. Instead, the chief information officer or the CISO is held responsible and accountable and is fully the only role with authority to drive the security risk management process, and there's no relationship to other business practices or other concerns. A better approach would be for all business leaders within the organization to be intimately engaged so that the question shifts from how secure are we or are we secure to how well are we managing risk within the boundaries that the company has defined and approved at the organization level. This type of approach leads documentation of risk appetite, which is a statement that ensures business holders understand the boundaries that we have to operate in, and risk capacity, which defines the maximum threshold of risk that we're willing to accept to be clearly understood. And if it comes from the board of directors or if it comes from the chief executive officer or the senior leadership team, it is much more difficult for other leaders in the business or other users in the business when you get to tier 2 and tier 3 to argue and not comply with the requirements that were defined. The benefit of establishing these items, risk appetite, risk capacity, the rules for accepting risk and for monitoring risk and for executing the process, if they're established at tier 1, it provides the greatest opportunity for everything to consistently flow into the rest of the organization. As a review from last week, the mission and business process is where you have things like the chief operating officer, the chief financial officer, the people in charge of sales and marketing, the chief human resources officer. Each one of those chief roles or director roles or senior vice president roles represents distinct mission, objectives of the organization, and business processes that need to be accomplished. And for the mission and business processes, there are going to be activities and technology that need to be managed securely. The role and responsibility in risk management at tier 2 is for the leaders of all of these mission and business processes to take the framework that was established at the organization level and then ensure that all of those requirements are applied on all of the technology, information systems, data, and infrastructure that exists at tier 3. Now, instead of just selecting security controls and doing risk management on technology systems, the entire organization is involved in the process, and this makes for a better approach. A good example of this in practice: if the organization said that the risk appetite for the business is $50,000, that represents that the business is willing to lose $50,000 in the pursuit of its goals, objectives, and outcomes that it wants to achieve. Anything above $50,000 would exceed our risk capacity. If it's going to exceed our risk capacity, it requires approval from the board, and everything else that we do as a risk management decision has to stay between $0 and $50,000 if people are going to approve it. Now, when you get more complicated, you have different levels of authority where you might define what is on this next table, where if it's low and is less than a certain amount, then the person who owns the information system at the system level is allowed to approve the risk and accept the risk because risk exists within the boundaries of risk appetite that were defined. If it's moderate, that often represents that the risk acceptance or the decision to allow the risk to remain within the organization has to come from a senior leader at the mission and business process level within the organization, and then anything that represents a high risk is going to exceed the capacity that was defined by the organization, and it requires special approval from the board of directors or from the CEO. Now, one of the most important items related to risk assessment is the measurement of impact. So before you begin the assessment, it's important to think about what the findings represent and who is allowed to accept the results of your assessment or who is required to make some type of decision. Defining risk appetite and risk capacity allows people who work as risk analysts to communicate the impact of their findings in a way that everybody understands and in a format that the organization is going to enforce. You can see in the table that context is also represented, so we've highlighted revenue, resilience, regulations, and reputation, and then using the scale of low, moderate, or high. This was a generic example, but you can see all kinds of information is available. From a revenue perspective, we have described for the default template organization that anything less than $100,000 is going to be low risk. Anything between $100,000 and $500,000 is going to be moderate risk, and anything over $500,000 in lost revenue is going to be a high risk. The same thing applies to resilience, where maximum tolerable downtime is something that you would identify when you do a business impact analysis for business continuity planning and disaster recovery, and it simply measures the amount of time that the system is down before it starts to cause problems for the organization. And so at a low level, when we are measuring the impact, we say that it is less than the maximum tolerable downtime. And so we're now operating within the level of risk appetite that was established. If the downtime equals the maximum tolerable downtime, now we're getting very close to the threshold, the boundary, and the capacity that was established. And anything that is going to last longer than what was established is a high risk that requires approval from the board. And so we apply the same approach to your regulatory requirements where there's no breach, there's a minor breach, or the regulators are very active in their oversight and penalties to the organization. From a reputational perspective, it's often related to how far the news travels. So if it's going to be limited and there's very little exposure and the news isn't talking about it, that would be a low reputational risk. If it ends up being in the national news or regional, that might be represented as a moderate risk. And then high risk might be significant embarrassment because everybody around the world knows what happens, they're holding us accountable for it, and it starts to affect other business practices. Now, with the measurements in mind and thinking about the approach that was laid out in the tiered organizational hierarchy, the illustration that's before you is really what we start to think about when we're doing risk assessment. The illustration highlights the entire risk model and all of the criteria that you have to consider when you're assessing, evaluating, and documenting the risk that faces the organization, a specific business practice, a specific information system, some type of data, or some type of activity. When you talk about threat source, the threat source is going to represent an adversary that exists inside the organization, often identified as insider threat, or somebody outside the organization that might be a nation state, a script kiddie, a competitor who's doing corporate espionage. Whoever the source is, that is the starting point for your analysis when you're doing a risk assessment. And along with that, you're going to have different characteristics that define the threat source. Your threat source is going to initiate a threat event, and part of your assessment is going to be to look at the likelihood of initiation. Sometimes you have a very motivated hacktivist, and their organization is going after you because you're doing something that they don't like. And so if it's environmental hacktivism, maybe my organization caused an oil spill, which leads hacktivists to compromise the organization because they want to put us out of business to save the planet. Or it could be that my organization is doing something that goes against the acceptable norms in society, and that is untenable by the people who are facilitating the harm. And so the likelihood of initiation is often related to the perspective of the threat source and the motivation that they have to harm the organization. Then your threat event is going to describe the sequence of actions that are taken to exploit the vulnerabilities that we have within the organization. In the NIST model, and this comes from NIST Special Publication 800-30, if you need this as a resource, NIST uses the combination of vulnerability, predisposing conditions, and security controls to describe the likelihood of exploitation of vulnerabilities that exist. Using this model, the vulnerability is simply a weakness that exists in the environment. I could have an unpatched operating system. I could have bad authentication where we're using single-factor authentication instead of multi-factor authentication. There is going to be some concern that starts to represent the vulnerability that we're facing. And in conjunction with that vulnerability, the level of severity is based on other conditions that surround us. So if I have single-factor authentication as the vulnerability, the other conditions are that we don't have good identity and access management. We don't have good security controls that require strong passwords for all of my users that are leveraging single-factor authentication, and all of the standard controls that we would put in place are missing, which describes a condition that could lead to the severity of the impact when the threat actor uses a threat event to exploit the vulnerability. And so getting the language right becomes a very important part of the process. In most cases, when you're dealing with vulnerability assessment or risk assessment or any other security assessment activity, there is always going to be a threat source, a threat event, some level of vulnerability, and the amount of vulnerability is going to be influenced by the controls that you have in place or the controls that you plan to implement. All of that is going to work together to describe the negative consequence that we're concerned with, which goes back to the table on the previous slide, and the adverse impact represents the total risk that is going to produce some outcome that the organization has to control or treat or respond to. Now, looking at this another way, NIST 800-30 has a table within the document that outlines a model for doing risk assessment. So when you prepare for the assessment, you're going to consider all the factors that we talked about. What is the organization's approach for framing risk, for understanding risk? What's the context that the risk assessment applies to? Where is the item that we're analyzing exist within the organization? Is it in a data center? Is it in the cloud? Is it an application on a computer system? All of this preliminary information is going to contribute to your risk assessment. Once you complete the prepare step, then you're going to conduct the assessment where you perform a sequence of activities where you identify your threat sources and the events that might lead to exploitation, the vulnerabilities and the predisposing conditions that influence whether or not exploitation is going to be successful. That is going to lead you to understand the likelihood of exploitation occurring, which allows you to determine the magnitude of impact, which ultimately defines the risk that you're facing for the item that you're assessing. The outcome of this in step 2 allows you to communicate results to the appropriate stakeholders. And then as an ongoing activity, you want to maintain the assessment so that if anything in the environment changes because of change management, because of an incident, because we did digital transformation, any meaningful change in the environment is going to drive us to conduct an additional assessment to make sure that we continue to maintain our response to risk at a level that's appropriate for the organization. Now, another model, and I apologize, I forgot the picture. I will make sure that I drop it into the Discord channel, is to use the NIST risk management framework, which describes the preparatory step in Special Publication 800-37 as the governance or strategic approach so that everybody in the 3 tiers of the organizational hierarchy understands what they're doing. It is from that prepare step that you then identify the security rating of the system as low, moderate, or high based on the information that it's processing. You select the controls that are required to reduce risk to an acceptable level. You implement the controls, which simply represents that you're putting the controls in place. You evaluate the controls to verify that they are producing the desired result. Once those steps are completed, then you submit a package to a business person, often at level 2 in the organization, who is going to authorize the system to operate, and that business person is going to assume responsibility for any negative consequence or outcome. And then once you have authorized and put the system, the service, the application, or the activity into production, you then perform continuous monitoring where you perform assessments periodically, you continue to evaluate the controls, You do everything within your capability that is appropriate and timely to ensure that the level of risk that was established or the level of risk that is required is achieved and maintained for the lifetime of the activity. Now, one of the reasons that I use NIST in this conversation is that if you went to csrc.nist.gov and you looked at the special publications, Special Publication 800-30, Revision 2, the risk management framework that's in Special Publication 800-37, and the tiered organizational hierarchy that's in NIST 800-39 are all free documents. So you can download them, you can read them. Once you understand them, you can use them in practice to build your own risk management program, whether you're doing it at home so that you can become accustomed to the language and the process, or whether you're doing it at work because it's going to enhance your abilities. All of these resources are complementary because they've been paid for by the tax dollars of the US citizens. NIST is a part of the US government. An alternative approach is found in the International Organization for Standardization has a document called ISO 27005 or 27005. It is a comparable alternative, and it is often used by organizations that operate globally. On a global scale, ISO 27005 is actually the most often selected risk management framework when you're dealing with information security risk, because it aligns with the information security management system and another set of controls that are associated with all of the practices. There are small nuances in the vocabulary that's used to describe the activity, but the outcome that you're producing is ultimately the same. Instead of risk framing, when you use ISO, instead of risk framing in NIST and ISO, you end up doing what they call context establishment. And part of that context establishment is going to identify, what does this assessment apply to? Once you identify what this assessment applies to, you then go through a 3-step phase that includes risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. In the identification step, the goal is to identify all of the assets that need to be part of the assessment, which is going to include information technology systems, servers, desktop computers, network infrastructure, data, cloud resources, everything that is going to allow you to store, process, and transmit information that is going to be related to this assessment. Based on your identification of assets, you then identify all of the threats or the threat actors who might act against those assets to compromise the organization. Another part of the process is to think about all of the controls that are in place or are planned to be implemented, the vulnerabilities that exist on all the assets, and then the consequences of compromise that you might encounter. Once you complete all of those steps in risk identification, you use the output from those steps as input into your risk analysis process. In your risk analysis, you're simply just looking at what is the total level of consequence that we're going to realize based on what we found in our identification. Then you're going to identify the incident likelihood, which measures on a scale of low, moderate, or high, or if you do it quantitatively, you're going to have a numerical result that says how likely are we to encounter this activity, and the level of risk determination is a model that allows you to compare the likelihood of something occurring with the impact if it were to occur within the organization. The output from your risk analysis is going to be input for your risk evaluation. And when I do risk evaluation using ISO 27005, the goal is to produce a prioritized list of risks, which is just an Excel file or a table or information inside of a GRC or governance, risk management, and compliance solution that allows me to document and list all of the findings with all of the information organized based on relevant categories. So my prioritized it could be something as simple as a risk register where I have identified the nature of the risk, the asset affected, the impact if exploitation were to be successful, the prioritization of remediation, who owns the solution to the problem, and all of the other factors are going to contribute to my success. Laptop plugged in. So please forgive me for the interruptions and the inequality issues. Once you get your prioritized list of risks, the prioritized list of risks is also going to include information about the relevance of your findings. There's going to be a mapping to business impact, which goes back to the table that I showed a few slides ago. And it puts you in a position to clearly communicate all of the findings that were produced from the assessment activity that was performed. Now, all of this sounds like a lot of disconnected information that's coming from many sources. So whether you use ISO 27005 or you use NIST 800-30, the final result of your risk assessment activity is going to be to document all of your findings in a risk assessment report. And so where we talk about the risk register as a tool to present all of the findings, the risk register is really an executive summary that presents all the data in a format that is easy for your stakeholders at Tier 2 and the leadership of the organization at Tier 1 to understand what did we find, why do I care, and what are we going to do about it. The full details of all of this information are generally documented in a report that risk analysts create to summarize all of the information that influenced the assessment, to document everything that was evaluated, and to present the findings and the impact and everything else that the organization is going to need to make a decision about risk treatment. Now you can see in the risk assessment report, there are some predefined categories in Appendix K from NIST 800-30. So this will be a good starting point if you've never done a risk assessment report to make sure that you have a framework that you can follow, to make sure that you document something that's going to be consumable by potentially non-technical business executives that are looking for information that's going to help them decide, how do I treat the risk and what is the priority and how does this fit into the greater context of the rest of the organization? The date of the assessment is going to be important because under normal circumstances, you're going to conduct multiple risk assessments on the same assets. I could have an information system that is an accounting information system, and we do an assessment at the beginning. So when I implement the system for the first time, there's going to be an assessment. We do assessments at least annually. So once a year on the anniversary of the first assessment, we're going to do a new assessment. If we're doing changes to the system, change management and risk assessment should be integrated activities. So if they want to update the infrastructure, if they want to install new software, if there's going to be a change in the data that is used inside the system, any change that happens to the accounting information system that we're using in this example or any other system is going to require an assessment so that you can verify the right controls are in place to keep risk at an acceptable level. And so now we've done an assessment at the beginning. We've done an assessment for each change that has happened over the lifetime of the system. We've done an assessment on the annual anniversary of the original assessment. All of these assessments require a date so that you can differentiate between one assessment and another assessment that was performed. The other thing that's going to be important is the purpose of the assessment so that you can declare to people who read the risk assessment report, why was this done? What was the scope? Why was I concerned? And what were we really looking for? And so if we do an initial assessment, then the date will be the date that it was performed, and the purpose of the assessment is going to describe this is the initial assessment for this system. The scope is very self-explanatory as well, and building upon the outline that's in the risk assessment report, the scope is going to identify all the other information that you had, whether I used NIST or whether I used ISO. So all the assets that we looked at, the threats that we thought about, the source of the threat, the nature of the threat, the motivation, all of that is going to be part of the conversation that describes the scope so that people understand what this applied to. Now, when you state whether this is an initial or a subsequent risk assessment, you also want to state the circumstances that prompted an update to the assessment. And so if we're doing an assessment because there was a security incident or a data breach or a ransomware attack, and we wanted to conduct a risk assessment to identify what was the weakness, that context and information would be part of the risk assessment report, and we would also include as attachments previous risk assessments that had been completed so that we can compare and contrast today's information versus information that was provided in the past. The level of risk that we're evaluating is also going to be important when you look at the fifth bullet, because the level of risk helps drive prioritization for the response to the findings to the assessment that's been completed. Imagine, if you will, that I work in a large organization that's conducting multiple assessments simultaneously. The level of overall risk as a finding from the assessment means that those assessments that produce high findings are going to be the highest priority. Assessments that identify moderate or medium findings are going to be the second priority. And then all of the assessments that demonstrate that there is a low level of risk are going to be the lowest priority, so that we apply our limited resources to the items of greatest influence or greatest impact on the business, its revenue, its regulatory requirements, its resilience, and its reputation. At the end of the report, and this is usually at the end because it becomes very lengthy, you want to list the number of risks that you identified and then list them in order of impact. So all of my high impact risks will be listed first, then all the moderates, and then all of the lows. Depending on the nature of what you're assessing, that could be a very large number of findings. It could be a smaller number of findings. For example, if you have never done a risk assessment on a cloud system that doesn't have the right controls in place, you might end up with a risk assessment report that has 100 findings. And those findings could span the spectrum from critical to high to medium to low to informational. And so that prioritization in the risks that you've identified also helps people know, what do we need to pay attention to and what is the big deal that's going to cause some kind of harm or impact for the organization. Once your risk assessment report is complete, this takes us back to the model that we started with. The output from your assessment is going to provide input for risk treatment and the rest of the activities in the risk management program. Now, as you spend more time with risk management, you will learn that the ideal approach is that risk treatment is a business decision. What happens in practice is that security teams and risk management teams take the information from the organization level that represents Tier 1, and they use that information to establish the scope and the process and the priorities and the requirements for conducting the assessment. Then they follow all the practices to identify, analyze, evaluate, and document the risk in a risk assessment report. The findings from the risk assessment report that describe risk that exists that requires some kind of treatment is what business stakeholders are going to use to define how they're going to respond to risk. Now, your risk response often is limited to 4 outcomes. I can mitigate the risk by putting controls in place or changing the environment to reduce risk to an acceptable level. I can accept the risk, which means that understanding the risk that we're facing, I'm not going to take any remedial action, and I accept that this risk exists. The other options are to transform the risk, the other options are to avoid the risk by transforming and changing your business activities and just not doing what is associated with the risk that was identified. The final option is to transfer the risk by applying cyber insurance to the equation. Now, in a lot of cases, when you're dealing with this in the real world, it's not just going to be one risk treatment option that you select, it's going to be multiple treatment options. And the option for your risk treatment plan is going to be influenced by the content and the information that's in your risk assessment report. For example, if I have a risk assessment report and all of the findings are low, the organization might accept the risk because based on our definition of risk appetite in the beginning, low means that the risk exists, but it remains within acceptable boundaries for the organization. Whereas if I had a risk assessment report that had moderate and high findings, I might treat the high findings and then accept the moderate findings because the cost of addressing all of the highs and moderates would exceed the budget and the resources that we have available for the business activity that has experienced the risk that was identified. And so for the high findings, I'm going to reduce them to moderate or low, and then I might supplement my risk treatment with insurance so that if a threat actor acts upon a vulnerability and exploits the system and produces a negative consequence, we have insurance to reduce the financial impact to the organization and help us clean up the problem as part of our security operations and incident response program. The final result of all of this, after I have the assessment and I understand the nature of the risk, we respond to that risk properly with the treatment plan. There's going to be some level of risk that always remains, and the business stakeholder, either at the system level, represented by Tier 3 in our organizational hierarchy, or the stakeholder at the mission and business process level, which is more of a leadership level, and the hierarchy is going to say, I accept the risk that remains, the treatment plan was appropriate, and then we're going to do risk monitoring and review using metrics and reporting and an assessment schedule to make sure that things stay where they're supposed to be. And then we'll also do risk communication so that our findings are reported up to the top of the organization. The stakeholder at the system level, at the mission and business level, and even at the CEO and the board level will receive input and information about what we found, what we did to address it, and what the plan is going forward. And all of this is supported inside of our risk management framework or our risk management program. Now, again, our objective in this conversation was to focus on risk assessment, but it's important to understand the inputs, the outputs, and how all of that information is used. With the time we have available, if you would like to say it verbally or you'd like to type it in the chat, I'm happy to entertain any questions that you have. All right, so it looks like there were no questions for this session. Again, because of Discord, if you think of something later, please log into the Discord channel. Feel free to post your question, and myself or a member of my team will be happy to respond and get you pointed in the right direction. Post the resources that we mentioned, NIST 800-30 for the risk assessment, NIST 800-37 for the risk management framework, and NIST 800-39 that contains the tiered organizational hierarchy. Each of those documents are not the easiest reading that you've ever seen, but they are good resources to help you understand in much greater detail the topic that I summarized for today's session. Another thing that I ask is that you remember to register weekly for each session. Registering for each session makes sure that we send you the right information, and we also send you a link about the recordings. The live lessons are important, but the registration ensures that every lesson that you want to attend is on your radar and that you get proper feedback and information about what's coming and what we are going to cover in the future. If you miss this session, or if you ever miss a session, remember that on the website for the program, CLASS-LLC.com/CCL, you can also get a link to the YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel is going to be your repository in addition to links in Discord that allow you to revisit past sessions and use the information to improve what you're doing as part of your cybersecurity career. We're intentionally offering this as a complimentary program. I like the idea of pay what you can. As you start to recognize value from your participation, any level of donation that you are willing and able to make is greatly appreciated. It allows us to continue to cover the cost of delivering the solutions and maintaining the environments and providing all of the resources that are included inside the Cyber Career Lab. If you can't donate, no problem. My hope is that everybody who is a participant in this program is going to increase in the cybersecurity profession, and you'll be able to donate and pay it forward to others in the future. The most important thing that you can do as a follow-up is share this information with your friends, with your family, with your colleagues. Sharing is caring, and the more people who know about the program, the more robust the conversations, the lessons, and the community on Discord will be. For now, I thank you for your participation, whether you're listening live or listening in person. Thank you for spending a couple of minutes with us today as we explored additional risk management practices in Season 1 of the Cyber Career Lab. I look forward to seeing you guys next week for the next lesson that is going to be focused on the 9 box of controls.